pursuing some more Augustine, if you're interested, is taking a look at this anthology. We, with our bump back, and I guess maybe Bishop's homily running a little long, we've got our hour and 15 down to an hour, so I'm going to do the best I can here. And try not to repeat too much of what people heard who were here the other night. Right, so the reason we are taking, so I was told basically that I had from Nicaea to the Reformation, and I got 3 hours. And so, right, so how do I divide that up, right? Well, 1 hour we're giving, and actually a little more than that, we gave to Augustine our bonus evening. But for the regular program, we got one of our 3 hours devoted to St. Augustine, right? Why one figure in this, I don't know, 1,000-year or so stretch gets all of that attention, right? It's really because St. Augustine, more than any other figure between the New Testament and maybe Aquinas would be the only other comparable figure. But I think even Augustine has a bigger influence on what we as Western Christians believe and practice in our faith, right? Augustine has more influence than really any other figure. He really is the person who shapes Western Christian theology. So that includes both us as Catholics and also Protestant Christians, right, are really profoundly shaped by St. Augustine and his work. So I think you really have to have an understanding of St. Augustine on some level to really be able to understand almost anything in theology as a discipline, at least in the West, right? And he really treats a whole bunch of very important topics. And so we're just going to try to give you a brief rundown so you have some sense of what's going on so that you can dive in and maybe do a little reading for yourself. So we talk about Augustine, and I often joke, after teaching for 10 years, I can't talk to more than 3 people without a whiteboard, so it's just what happens. I will try to keep it as legible as I can, and if you can't read something, just pester me like my children and be like, Dad, your handwriting is terrible. What does that say? Don't call me Dad, though. So St. Augustine, right, and again, we can't possibly cover all of it. One way to look at Augustine, I think, that is a little helpful in terms of understanding some of the big themes that run through lots of different areas of his life, is to look at some of the big controversies that he struggled with. So a lot of times in church history we focus on the heresies and the controversies and all of the isms, right? So you got all kinds of isms, different heresies. So there are kind of 3 isms that really shape a lot of Augustine's thought. So there's Manichaeanism, there is Donatism, and there is Pelagianism. Okay, so now I know some of you were here a couple weeks ago now and heard about some of these things. Can anyone refresh our memory on what Manichaeanism is? I know there are a lot of big words to write down quick. Manichaeanism, or sometimes Manichaeism, different ways that it's written out.
The light and the dark.
Yeah, good. So this isn't so much a heresy as just a different religion, right? And so, again, not to rehash everything from the other night, but everybody probably has heard that St. Augustine, right, has this long struggle finally to his conversion when he's an adult, right? And so there are a lot of things, of course, that happen along that path leading to his conversion. And so one of the things that's important in kind of shaping him is that between his kind of Sunday school upbringing by his mother, Monica, and his ultimate conversion, he goes through a period where he's part of the Manichaeans, right? And the Manichaeans are dualists. Not like in the sense of shooting each other with pistols at dawn, right? But dualists in the sense of people who divide reality into two halves. Right? So there's the good light half, and that's what is the spiritual part of life, right? So your spirit is a part of that good light realm. And then there's the bad, dark, bodily, material half, right? And so they divide the world into these two halves of light and dark, and they see those halves as in constant struggle, right? And so the body is part of that dark side of reality, right? And the basic idea is, it's a big complicated, it's a religion, so they have a lot that they have to say. But the basic idea is that our spirits have somehow gotten entangled in this dark physical realm, right? So the point of one's life as a Manichaean is to escape from this bodily dark realm to the light and to the spirit, right? And so as dualists, they have a very low view of the body, right? The body is a bad thing. There's also two gods that go with this, right? So there's a bad creator God who makes the physical world, and then there's a good spiritual God who's trying to kind of rescue us from this. So anything you do that makes you more involved with the body is going to be a bad thing, and anything you can do to minimize your connection with the body is going to be a good thing. And right, if you know anything about St. Augustine's struggles with bodily temptation, you can probably understand why he might find this appealing, right? This seemed to fit his experience, right? That he had this inability to resist bodily temptations. He felt like he is at war with his body for much of his life, right? And so that is a real challenge for him, and is going to help attract him to this group. Right. The other thing we talked a little bit about that this does is that it gives you a really nice explanation for why we have struggle and suffering and even death in this world, right? Because if you have these two cosmic forces battling it out for eternity, there's going to be a lot of conflict and mess and stuff in the middle, right? And so when you look around and see all this turmoil and suffering in the world, this gives you a nice, easy answer for that. It's because you have the light and dark sides fighting each other. Unlike monotheism, if you only believe there's one absolutely good, all-powerful God, it's a harder job to answer the question of why is there evil and suffering in the world, right? Because if there's this all one powerful, loving God, why does he let all this bad stuff happen, right? Which is a question every Christian, every monotheist has dealt with at some point or another. Augustine doesn't see a good answer for that. These people seem to provide a good answer, and they seem to speak to his experience. And so he becomes a Manichaean for a while. Eventually, their theology, he sees problems with it, and he's disillusioned with meeting the people who are supposed to be the experts. Right? So he meets the hierarchy, if you will, of the Manichaeans, and he is underwhelmed by them as persons and by their understanding of the world. And so he becomes kind of disillusioned with them. But that's an important part in his kind of formation, if you will. He becomes a Christian, ultimately, through a whole host of things we talked about a bit last time. Through studying philosophy, through escaping the Manichaeans, through coming to think about Scripture a little differently. We'll get to that here in a little bit. And enters into the church. And then ultimately he gets shanghaied into being a bishop, which kind of happened back in those days. If you were a single educated male, you didn't want to wander into a town that was lacking a bishop because you might just get conscripted. It did happen, and it kind of happens to Augustine. He intended to just be a monk and sit around and contemplate things. But anyways, he becomes a bishop in North Africa, right? So he's in North Africa. And North Africa, in Augustine's time, is the biggest issue they're facing for most of his life, at least, is Donatism. And Donatism this is a Christian heresy, right? So this isn't another religion. But Donatism, anybody recall, I think we talked about this a little the other day, what Donatism is about? It's not one of your more famous ancient heresies. Well, I'll jog your memory maybe a little bit. This is so the one thing that you might know from the Donatist controversy is out of this is where we get our principle of ex opere operato. Anybody know what the principle of ex opere operato is? I guess I maybe should have asked that before I told you this would be helpful. Okay, so you're going to get a nice Latin phrase you can throw around to impress your Catholic friends and family. Ex opere operato is a Latin term about the sacraments, right? And this is a way of expressing our belief that the grace happens, that the sacrament is real. It really takes place from the doing of the act, basically, right? And so it basically means that if the sacrament is performed properly with the right form, the right matter, the right minister, the grace is there, right? It works. And the reason this is important is because the kind of partner phrase is ex opere operantis, which is from, I never know how to translate that one. But it's basically from the work of the doer, or the person doing it, right? And so ex opere operantis focuses on the work of the person performing the sacrament, right? And it focuses your emphasis on the minister and how they're performing it, right? Now, obviously, the status of the people, particularly the people receiving the sacrament, can have an impact on how effective it is, right? How efficacious the graces are. So if you go to Mass and you are in a sour mood, and let's say you don't even have a mortal sin on your soul, but you just have a whole bunch of venial sins and you just are not really, right? You are going to get, the graces of the sacrament are going to be less effective for you than if you were there, properly disposed, really paying attention. And then of course, if you have a mortal sin on your soul and you receive the sacrament of the Eucharist, that grace is there, right? It works, but you're not getting the benefit from it, and in fact, you're compounding your problems by receiving the sacrament when you shouldn't be. And again, if a priest is in a state of mortal sin, or is in kind of schism from the church somehow, and if he performs the sacrament happens. From the doing of, if an ordained man uses the proper form and has the bread and wine, the sacrament happens. Now, whether he's going to get benefits from that is going to depend on his disposition. But the sacrament really happens. Right now, this is an important principle for Catholic theology. Why in particular? Why is this such an important thing for us to affirm as Catholics? It might be a little clearer for us than maybe for a generation or two ago.
The scandal, the abuse.
Yeah, right. So what happens if you have priests or bishops who don't have a proper disposition, who are not leading good Christian lives? What does that mean for the ministry of the church? Are the sacraments that they're performing really good and valid, right? So I entered the church in 2002. I started discerning coming into the Catholic Church a few years earlier than that. And I was in Boston and then New York, right? So if you know your recent Catholic history, I was in Boston and New York right when kind of the storm of the sex abuse scandals was breaking out, right? And so there were a lot of, this was a very live question. What do you do when you find out that your pastor for years and years has been involved in heinous sin? What does that mean for all of the Eucharists you received, all the confessions you've gone to, the confirmations, all of that, right? And you can easily understand how some people might assume that if horrible father whoever performed these sacraments, that somehow they are tainted, right? That they are not real. Now, there are very real problems with those situations, and the church needs to do a lot to reassure people of its commitment to their well-being, and we know all of this. But the one thing that we can say is that, we have a lot of stuff we have to do, but the sacraments are real, right? The fact that your priest maybe was not in a state of grace does not change the validity of the Eucharist you received, or the absolution, that was the word I was looking for, of your sins in confession, or any of those things. All of those things are still real and valid and happen for you, regardless of what it might mean for him to be in this state. And this comes from Augustine, right? The spelling out this idea. And he has to deal with it not because of a sex abuse scandal, but because of these guys known as the traditores. Right, so the traditores, again, more Latin, an easy one though, it just means traitors, or people who hand over. Traditore means to hand over something, right? And so Augustine, sorry, so much to cover. Augustine, around the year 400, right? So he's alive in the year 400. He dies in 430, I think. Mm-hmm. We're going to pretend that's not being filmed, if I'm wrong. Google corrupts the minds even of professors, because we just Google everything. You don't have to memorize stuff like that anymore. So we're good. But he's alive at 400. I know that much. And he converts several years prior to that, right? So he's born in mid-late 300s, grows up in the late 300s. So in the Christian world, right, the big news in the 300s is Constantine and the legalization of Christianity, right? So Christianity had only become legal in like Augustine's grandparents' day, right? And so they're still dealing with a lot of the consequences of that. So one of the consequences of that is that, again, we all have this vision of when the Roman soldiers break into the church gathering, that every good, pious Christian there just nobly lines up and goes down to the Colosseum and refuses to burn the incense and faces the lions, and then and certainly that did happen, right? But probably if we reflect on it, we'll probably say, well, probably not everybody who got busted by the Roman soldiers went down and piously refused to burn the incense. Some of them, in fact, did apostatize. Some of them, in fact, even handed over the sacred scriptures or the vessels from the altar to the Romans. Right? So that's what this name comes from. These are the people who handed over the church's scriptures, the church's vessels, or more generally just collaborated with the Roman oppression instead of resisting. Well, when Constantine makes Christianity legal, you don't need to do this anymore. And in fact, as we talked about last time, Constantine doesn't make Christianity the official religion. That's later, that's Theodosius. But it does become abundantly clear that this is the direction the empire is moving in, and it becomes an advantageous thing to be a Christian. Right? So you get lots of people entering the church, and some of the people coming into the church are the people who had left the church during the persecution. Right? So you have these people coming back, including, in some cases, clergy even, right, who had been involved with this, and clergy who had allowed these people back into the church, right? And you can imagine this was a big problem, right? Because if you're there at Mass on Sunday, and your parents were martyrs under the persecution of Diocletian, just a couple decades back, and lo and behold, Bob and Sue from next door, who had told the Romans where the meeting was and had handed over the scriptures and the sacred vessels, well, they come waltzing back into Mass, and they're going to sit down in the pew next to you, and you're going to have to do the sign of peace with them, and they're probably sneezing into their hand, right, before the sign of peace. And so, you are not too pleased that these people are in your church, right? And so, this is a big fight in North African church. And so ultimately what happens is the Donatists splinter off from the Catholic Church because they will refuse any readmission of the traditores, right? And there's, again, the actual details of it are kind of complicated. It has to do with the ordination of a particular bishop, who the argument was that his ordination line is compromised by this. But the main question is whether or not the church can readmit this kind of a very serious sinner or not. And the Donatists say, no, there are certain sins that if a Christian does them, you're out, right? We do not readmit people who apostatize. The Catholic Church, on the other hand, obviously there are going to be consequences for these people. I think I mentioned in the evening, right, the penances for serious sins in the early church, or it was not 10 Hail Marys and a couple Our Fathers and, you know, be nice to 5 family members over the next week. It's more like you're going to kneel outside a church during Mass for the next, 20 years kind of thing. So it was serious, but it was a possibility, right, that there could be forgiveness of very serious post-baptismal sin. And so there's a split about this. Now, Augustine comes in and argues vehemently against the Donatists, right? He says, look, the sacraments, the grace of the sacraments does not depend on whether or not the priest or bishop is spotless, right? What makes the sacraments happen? If it's not the priest who's doing stuff, who is it that's doing stuff in the sacraments? God, right? It is God who works in the sacraments through the priest. So Augustine's main point here is that it's God who does the work. And this is going to be a very important point in his theology as a whole, right? And again, this makes sense when you think about his conversion, like we talked about the other night. So the story of Augustine's conversion is famous. He struggles for years, even after he has this philosophical awakening that he wants to stop sinning, stop leading this kind of life. He's unable to do it. He just keeps sinning. It's not until he experiences God intervening in his life. He has this moment in the garden where the voice says, take up and read, and he picks up his scriptures and he reads the passage, and it talks about not leading a life of sin anymore, but embracing the faith. And he takes this as divine intervention, right? God intervenes and finally gets him to change. He thinks the same thing happens in the sacraments. God works through the sacraments. He's the one saving you through baptism, through the Eucharist, not the priest or not the bishop. All right. Which leads into his next controversy, right? Pelagianism. So Pelagianism is named after Pelagius. So Pelagius argues that, well, anybody recall what Pelagius?
Yeah, he argued that you could save yourself without God's grace.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, this is a fight about how salvation works.
Mm-hmm.
And Pelagius really emphasizes that we as people, if we put in enough effort, we could avoid sin entirely. And now for most of us, he's going to say, most of you are probably going to slip up and have some sins. But he thinks you can also work to dispose yourself for God to give you the grace, right? So that you will acknowledge that you've had some sins, but you kind of prepare yourself in such a way that God's going to look at you and be like, oh, well, obviously this person should get some grace. And then there's a real emphasis on our role in bringing about our salvation. Whether or not, he probably doesn't think most people can ever avoid sin completely, but he is going to say that you can do a lot to anticipate God's grace. Now, why does he say this, right? Again, when you have to know kind of what's going on in the Christian world, right? You have this huge growth in the Christian church. in the 4th century, in the 300s, right? And as you can imagine, when you get a huge growth like that, not everybody who comes into the church is going to be like a really devout, pious person, right? Some of them are just there because that's what everybody's doing right now. And a lot of them are probably there because that's just what all the cool kids are doing now. And so, again, if you were one of the really devout Christians who kind of lived through all of this, and then you look around and you see the churches filled with all these people who aren't really leading good, pious Christian lives, you're going to be upset about this. So Pelagius basically becomes a revival preacher. And Pelagius, he was a monk from Britain, of all places, travels to Rome, sees all of these really not good Christians, and starts preaching revival, starts saying that people need to take their living the moral Christian life seriously, or they're not going to be saved. Which is generally a good thing, but the problem is he preaches it in such a way that he really makes it out to be, it's our work that is going to bring about our salvation. Not what Augustine is arguing, it's God who does the work in you. So they get into a big fight. And ultimately, Augustine is going to argue very strongly that salvation is God's work almost entirely, right? So when we talk about the grace and works, Augustine is going to say, yes, you need to do works, but every work you're going to do is going to be supported by God's grace, is going to be prompted by God's grace, and Pelagius is going to argue against him, and then other people follow, and it really, that fight occupies the last 20 or so years of Augustine's life. We don't have the time to really go into all of the details of that, but basically where Augustine ends up, and this is where I kind of go back and forth with Augustine. Sometimes he kind of really almost convinces me, and then other times I'm like, what was this guy thinking? So if you look in your, so I gave you these excerpts, and again, I'd encourage you, if you're interested, this is a good book to get started in reading Augustine. We're not going to read through all of this, you can just look at these later. But the first couple of pages, the part about faith as a gift and predestination. So if some of you have some good Bible-thumping Calvinist friends and family, you may have heard that term predestination before. That's really what grows out of this fight with Pelagius, right? So that ultimately Augustine gets a view of original sin that is has a very profound impact on us, right? So for Augustine, original sin means that you are damned, right? You are spiritually dead. You are separated from God. Your nature is completely corrupted, right? That you cannot do a good moral act for Augustine if you are still in original sin, right? So even if it seems like you're doing something good, you're doing it out of pride, you're doing it because you want something, whatever it might be, your nature is just completely corrupted, right? So the image I usually use is from my childhood on Saturday mornings with Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. Right, so you know when Wile E. Coyote runs a little too far off the cliff, and then he pauses for a moment, and then recognizes his state, and then he falls for a ridiculously long time, and there's a little puff, right? And then if it's a really bad one, then you see the puff, and you see this mangled body there for a minute, and then you hear this, and then the boulder lands, right? So then the boulder lands on the coyote, so he is smushed doubly. That is basically Augustine's view of our situation after the fall, right? That is kind of where you are at spiritually as somebody affected by original sin. And we all share in this. Augustine's idea is kind of Adam is the representative of humanity as a whole. And so when Adam does this horrible thing, humanity does it, right? And we all share in that squished spiritual flatness as a result. as a result of that, a lot of things follow, right? So, but one of the things is going to be, when you think about salvation, it's really got to be God who does the work, right? Wile E. Coyote is not doing anything. He's, right, the only thing that is going to help him is some character coming along with a little humorous looking ambulance and a little stretcher and picking him up and throwing him in the stretcher and getting him. That's basically how salvation works for Augustine. God looks at all of these squished people and he finds some of them, he chooses some of them and picks them up and gives them the grace, jumpstarts their spiritual lives, and now they can do stuff. But even after that happens, and gets more and more developed as Augustine has this fight, he's going to say, from that point on though, God is always going to be in you, kind of motivating you, enabling you. And he talks about it in such a way that it's really hard to find the part that you do. It really kind of ends up in places where it's basically God does everything good that you do. It's only when you do something bad that was definitely you, not God. Which makes sense. But that's the story in a nutshell. Any questions real quick before we get to consequences of that? Dusty?
One question that comes to mind, and I don't know if in any of his writings, does he engage with like any of the pre-Christian societies like the Greeks, or like I'm just wondering how he would think about how God has worked like before Christ, and how, because this view of, to me, what makes it, I mean, I see how this works theologically. I see how this makes it kind of a tight system of like that we need God to act first. But what about when we see virtue, or we see kind of people with glimpses of truth that are outside of even like pre-Christian societies, or people that we know to be separated from Christ, or you know, take the hypothetical example of somebody who's, you know, born in the middle of Africa or something, and they never get to be baptized, but they show virtue, and so there's clear that there's some connection with the good. Does he raise any of those questions, or how do you think he would deal? How do you think he might deal with a question?
Well, he does. I mean, he talks about it quite a bit in the City of God.
Okay.
Because he talks about Roman virtues and the Roman state, and he talks about when Rome was really flourishing. Okay, because in Augustine's day, Rome is collapsing. But he talks about back in the good old days, there was a certain kind of virtue in Roman society, and so part of you can kind of sense that there are certainly some hesitancy I think most people should have. I think in the midst of the fight, Augustine maybe develops these ideas a little further than he ought. Who am I to say that? But I think the tradition as a whole.
You can say that in this room. In the main assembly, you can't say it because he's looking, but.
Yeah. And I think the tradition as a whole, at least the Catholic tradition, now those ideas really get picked up again 1,000 years later by Luther and Calvin. So they aren't. So when we criticize our Lutheran and Calvin brethren about various points, it is helpful to recall that a lot of their fundamental ideas come from our St. Augustine that we all share. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. But yeah, I think he carried, and I think there's a dichotomy in his own thinking, right? That he does acknowledge there's this virtue in early Roman Republic, at least. Now, he would also say that it's kind of like physics, you know, and again, I'm no physicist, but you can either look at light as little particles of photons, or you can look at it as waves. You can't actually, you have to pick one or the other, and they can both be useful for talking about certain parts of light. Similarly, Augustine stood up every Sunday and gave homilies, and he told his congregants, his parishioners, and it's interesting, I certainly recommend reading some of his homilies if you don't want to dive into a huge theological treatise. There are collections of his homilies that are really very nice. But he told them all the things that you guys hear, right? About living good Christian lives and resisting temptation and being kind to the poor and all of this. telling them this because they need to hear this, and hopefully it will encourage them to do it. So he does that, but then he'll go back to his office and he'll write a treatise about how you can't actually do anything. It's only if God works within you to cause it that it's going to happen, right? So there's kind of these two different ways of looking at the world that don't quite fit together perfectly, right? And so he would say, like Cicero, a great virtuous guy in many ways, and Augustine would acknowledge some of those virtues, but he would also say that he was completely and totally corrupted by original sin, right? So that, yeah, it is a challenge. And I think he, at points, you can see him kind of struggling with this. But the logic of this view just seems to fit to him.
Would Augustine been able to sit down for a 3-hour supper with Luther?
Wow. I just don't know.
I'm talking about indulgence, a life well lived, those kinds of things, and especially God and grace. I mean, would there have been a dialogue, or would they?
They would have had some interesting agreements and some very interesting disagreements.
Yeah,
I mean, so they both have this huge emphasis on grace, but for Augustine, it is very much through the sacraments and through the bodily means of the sacraments. Whereas for Luther, it's only through faith, right? This immaterial faith in God. It would be a fascinating discussion to hear. God willing, I hope God conveyed graces to Luther in his final days, and maybe someday I can look at that conversation.
I mean, I think
I think he was a fiery person who got carried along, and I just hope he and God sorted it out in the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would be fascinating.
I think it would too, between Augustine and Luther.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to grapple with this here on
Uh-huh.
this last part of the plate. So did Augustine move from that thought then, is what you're saying, that he struggled with these things? That
Yeah.
And then you said that's where Calvin and Luther kind of took that and ran with that.
Right.
But did Augustine then evolve further from this thought?
No, he becomes more and more, he's fighting against the Pelagians, and as he does it, he becomes more and more completely the opposite, right? So that it just becomes, the human role in salvation, and some of the final treatises Augustine writes, it's really difficult to figure out what it is exactly that you do as a person. Now he will write and say, yes, you have to cooperate, you have to pray, you have to do all of these things.
That's God who gives the grace.
But then when he turns around, well, how does that happen? Well, God will prompt you to cooperate. God will prompt you to. So it ends up kind of, his explanations of how it works end up undercutting, it seems, us really doing anything. I mean, and to be fair to Augustine, this is a philosophy problem in general, right? Nobody can explain really well how free will works, right? What prompts our choices. For Augustine, it's grace if it's a good choice, and it's us if it's a bad choice. But he's still, one of the major criticisms, we'll talk about this next time, the Eastern Church and Eastern theology. One of the main criticisms of us Westerners is that we try to define stuff too much. And I think sometimes they're right. I think maybe Augustine goes a little too far in trying to explain how all of this works within us. And he kind of paints himself, I think with each treatise he writes, he kind of ends up painting himself into more and more of a corner. But
Because there's mystery involved with this, obviously. We can't possibly know exactly how
Yeah.
it works, so.
yeah.
I would get that too. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I spent so long on the opening points, my computer locked me out. There we go. Okay. So, with some time that we've got left, right? But I think it's worth going over, because this is really, you have to know what's going on here, because this shapes everything else Augustine does, right? And so I think it is important to have a sense of that. So what I wanted to then talk about for what I've got left is kind of some of the things that come out of this, right? And particularly some ones that are going to be important for us as 21st century Catholics, right? And so, that's a very ineffective eraser button. So
It
one
used to
of,
be white erase boards, now they're just boards.
yeah. So one of the main places where this becomes an issue is when Augustine talks about sex and marriage, right? And so I'm not going to make any judgments. I think some of you are maybe a little older than some of my undergraduates. We're not supposed to make those kind of judgments by looking at people anymore, but maybe a little over 19, I don't know. So when I teach my undergraduates, all they've ever known is theology of the body, right? That's the only Catholic view of sex and marriage that they have ever experienced, right? And so one of the challenges is trying to get them to understand why it's such a big deal, right? Because they don't know anything about how the church sometimes saw and treated sex and marriage prior to theology of the body, right? Where did this thing come from? What was it a reaction to? And largely, theology of the body, now look, I'm not one of these people who think that before John Paul II, the church was just absolutely horrible about sex and marriage, and it was just a wasteland for 2,000 years, right? That's
No, not 2,000 years, a sense of trend.
yeah, that's an oversimplification, although I think it's fair to say that John Paul II did revitalize parts of the tradition that didn't get enough emphasis for a long time, right? And so I think a lot of the negative attitudes towards sex and marriage that have been part of Catholic tradition for a long time stretch back to Augustine, right? And Augustine, now why is this the case? And what do I mean here? Well, again, we don't have a ton of time. I did give you some excerpts that really focus on this. So if you go to the next pages, Augustine has one of the people he is fighting with at the end of his life is Julian of Eclanum. And Julian was a Pelagian. So he was a follower of Pelagius. But he and Augustine get in this war of letters and books. And one of the things they fight about, along with fighting about how salvation works, is fighting about what's a proper Christian view of sex and marriage. Right? And again, I'll let you read this more. But basically, if you look at what Julian says on marriage and concupiscence, Julian is going to say, well, we have as human beings sexual desire. Sexual desire is used well within marriage. Sexual desire is not used well if it is allowed to go into excess in lust, or if it, God forbid, results in fornication or adultery. Then it becomes a bad use of this sexual desire, sexual nature that we have as human beings. And he'll say, and it's a good and noble thing if you decide to forego sexuality entirely and pursue a celibate ascetic life. What Augustine is going to say in response, and again, you can read the excerpts I gave you there at your leisure. Concupiscence.
Yes, correct.
Something like that. Concupiscence. You all know the word. What does concupiscence mean? I'm sure there's probably a catechism teacher or something out there somewhere. What is concupiscence? You all have it, just so you know. Sorry.
Propensity to sin.
A propensity to sin. Good. That's certainly part of the right answer. Anything else? All right. Propensity to sin, but in particular, it is an inordinate desire. What does that mean? Right. Well, you know, when you teach in college, you just have to use big words. But inordinate desire means an out-of-order desire, right? So, an easy example is, right, in terms of food, right? It is a natural desire to want food. It is apparently a natural desire for my 14-year-old son to want all the food. Right, and the fact that he's already here, just having turned 14 is a little disturbing. Be that as it may. But you can have an inordinate desire for food, right? And this could maybe be described as America's current
Obesity.
driving problem, right? As an inordinate desire for food. You can want food in a way beyond what is actually good for you as a person, to the point where it becomes detrimental to you as a whole person, right? And so usually when we talk about concupiscence, that is what we mean. So obviously this is also true of sex, right? That Julian argues that there is a good and natural sexual desire that God has put in us, and that when it is kept within the confines of marriage and all the other things are being done properly, that is just a good natural part of who we are as humans. It's only when it is indulged in excess that it becomes a problem. Right, and basically what Augustine argues, when Augustine talks about sexual desire, for Augustine, sexual desire per se equals concupiscence. Right, for him, all sexual desire is an inordinate desire. Right, because he believes, well, there's a couple different reasons. Why? Part of this is, I think you have to say, from his experience, right? That he has experienced sexual desire not as something that could be properly controlled. It is something that is just by its nature disruptive of a good life. It's always kind of dangerous to psychologize people and their ideas, but I think in the Confessions he gives us good evidence for saying that this is part of it. Part of it also, though, is his philosophy, right? So Augustine is heavily influenced by Plato, although he probably read Plato's followers more than actually reading Plato himself. But if you know anything about Platonic philosophy, right, the mind is good, the body not so much. Although they're not Manichaeans, the body can be good, but it ought to point you to higher things. But especially in Greek philosophy and Platonic philosophy, you have this idea of, there's a real emphasis on reason, right? Now what ought to define the human person is reason. And for Augustine, if you read a lot of it, one of the big problems he has with sexuality is that even within the confines of marriage, part of the nature of sexuality is that it is not reasonable, that it involves intense emotions and desires and feelings, and yes, and you are not being guided by reason at every moment and every step, right? And for him, that is just danger, right? He thinks it is unhuman in a literal sense, right? For him, to be a human being is to have reason and control of everything else, right? So the fact that even within what the church would say is perfectly moral marital sex, that's not the way it works. For Augustine, that is a big problem, right? And the fact that reason is not in perfect control is a big part of why he reaches this conclusion that all sexual desire is disordered. Right now, look, he recognizes that not everybody is going to become celibate. Right? And you'll see in these excerpts, right, basically what he says happens in marriage when sex is engaged within marriage is still, for Augustine, it is only good in a qualified sense if you are engaging in sex for the purposes of procreation. Right? So if you know for some reason that procreation is not going to be the result of this, you ought not to, as far as Augustine is concerned. Right? So there's no NFP for Augustine. Or past the age of menopause or whatever, if a woman is already pregnant, right? And again, if some of you may have heard of some of these ideas from the Catholic practices in previous years, that was not an uncommon idea. What happens in marriage if they have relations not because they want children, but out of desire? What Augustine says is, basically it's kind of like a little venial sin, right? He's willing to, he knows Paul allows it, he knows it's but you ought not to. But he understands that this is probably the best possible conduit for most people. So it's kind of a venial sin. And then everything else is obviously, right, forbidden. And he talks about this at length, right? So he thinks, now early in his career, and this is part of what, hopefully I can get to a couple of last things here. In his younger years as a bishop, he speculates about Eden, right? He thinks maybe Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, would have reproduced some other way. Who knows? Maybe there would have been different mechanics. Maybe there'd be like buds or I don't know. I don't know what he envisions happening. He thinks maybe it wasn't the way we do it now, because that's got all these problems. Right? Now, to Augustine's credit, as he matures, and I think as he becomes more immersed in Scripture and a little less purely philosophical and Platonic, he leaves that idea behind. Right? He thinks that in the garden, sex would have happened basically the same way it does in our experience, but it would be a perfectly rational process. It would not be driven by passions or emotions or feelings. It would be driven by reason, right? And so, but basically the mechanics, if you will, would be the same. Which I think, to be fair to Augustine, he over time comes to recognize that his earlier ideas were more philosophy than Bible. And I think he recognizes, so Julian calls him a Manichaean. Julian says, you never really left this behind, you just think the body is horrible and bad. And I don't think that's fair, because I think Augustine isn't a Manichaean. He doesn't think the body is intrinsically bad or evil. He does think the power of sexual desire is intrinsically bad or problematic.
But don't you think a lot of that is the early part of his life was spent as Mick Jagger until the conversion?
Now, again,
I mean, come on. I mean,
I do think, but again, as I think I said the other evening, Augustine did struggle with this, but he was not, his lifestyle was not, he exaggerates a bit about his decadence, right? He was not going to be on like an MTV reality show. He is not living like the Kardashians or whoever it is nowadays, the people, right? He had a mistress, a concubine, but he had the same one for like 15 years. They had a child together that he cared for very much. He only ended the relationship because his mother forced him to. So, now, he admits all that was sinful, but he was not, it was not as if he was like, you know, some of the athletes you hear bragging about like the thousands of conquests. That was not Augustine. But no, his struggles I think do play a big part. Yes?
Dr. Pastor, if Julian was a Pelagian, right?
Yeah.
Was he then considered out of the church, or was
Yeah.
really?
He was condemned. But he refused, so when Pelagius was condemned at the Council of Ephesus, and afterwards bishops were asked to sign a document condemning him, and Julian refused to sign the document condemning Pelagius. So as far as I know, Julian ended his life separated from the church. Now I think Julian said a lot of things about sex and marriage that are closer to current church teaching than Augustine. Now, on the other issues, I think Julian's views are problematic. Augustine maybe goes too far, but I think Julian is still a Pelagian, right?
So Pelagianism was a heresy.
Yes, Pelagianism was condemned at the Council of Ephesus.
Because I remember when you were talking about it a couple of weeks ago, I was going, yeah, okay, this makes sense.
Well, yeah.
Going,
Part-
hold on.
And it's hard to do it really justice just quickly, but it does sometimes seem kind of reasonable, parts of it. But the fatal flaw in Pelagianism is that it allows humans to take the first important step.
Okay.
Right, so that's the crucial thing. What we have to say as Catholics, we don't, if you look at current church teaching, it's basically not what Augustine develops in contrast to Pelagius. Some key ideas from Augustine are still there. But one key idea that we keep from Augustine is that it always has to be grace first, right? So that idea of prevenient grace is extended by God to us before we do anything to deserve it. That's true to this day. Pelagius did not accept that idea. Now, the difference between current teaching and Augustine is, for Augustine, that prevenient grace was only extended to select predestined individuals, whereas the current church teaching is basically that God makes prevenient grace available to basically everybody.
I'm running into the phrase in the history of the church between the councils of 1850 and the Vatican, semi-Pelagianism.
Yeah, well, and a lot of people argue that the church has been semi-Pelagian
Yeah.
since the time of Augustine. But there's a big debate. There's a lot of scholars who say semi-Pelagianism isn't a helpful term because it mixes too much up.
They'll use the word Phariseeism and semi-Pelagian almost as synonyms.
Yeah.
That you got all these groups and things, but I never know what to make of it when I see it.
Well, and it is complicated. I mean, one of the things, if you look at church history, the church has defined a lot of things about the Trinity, about the nature of Christ, about the sacraments even. There's very little defined about the way salvation works. There's a lot of it that's left open for different ways of thinking about it. I think my time is just about out, although I blame it on the bishop. Don't make no offense, no offense for the poor people who watch this on YouTube. Okay, really quickly, there's a number of others. So I gave you some selections on Augustine's view of like just war in the state, which is really interesting. Augustine is the guy who kind of founds Christian thinking about just war theory. At the end of it, I gave you some selections he gives about his views of heaven, which I think are really interesting. And again, it's easy to focus on his predestination ideas and his condemnation of sex and marriage, basically, to get a really negative view of Augustine sometimes. I struggle with that with some of my students. I think it's important, if you look at his views of the resurrection, I think they're beautiful. I think it's a very nice proof that Augustine is not a Manichaean, and he's not mostly a Platonic philosopher who's just dressed up as a Christian. That he really has a truly biblical Christian view of the person and of eternity, right? So for him, eternity is very much a resurrection of the body, right? That we will be embodied persons for eternity with God. And again, if you want to look at those excerpts, he writes really beautifully about how marvelous this bodily existence. Of course, Paul tells us we don't know what it's going to be like. It's going to be a radical transformation that we can't really imagine. But Augustine kind of speculates, and it's very beautiful. So he is not down on the body per se, despite some issues with particular aspects of it. And I gave you, there's an excerpt in there too, which I think I'm glad this guy chose, because I always emphasized it when I did this before I found his nice collection. One of the ideas that floated around in the ancient world with guys like Plato and Aristotle was that basically, and this is them, not me, that women are essentially defective men. Right? So if you ask Plato or Aristotle, how is it that some people are born male and some people are born female? And basically the answer was, well, something goes a little wrong when a girl is born. Right? And because they're not very rational and all of the typical stereotypical things that people say. And in the ancient world, this was the kind of common view, particularly amongst philosopher types, right? So Augustine is immersed in this stuff. And certainly there are any number of passages we could point to that are problematic in Augustine's view of women. But I do think it's very nice in this excerpt from the City of God when he's talking about the resurrection, because some Christian thinkers had speculated, if that is true, maybe in heaven, everybody will be male, right? Because we won't need to reproduce anymore. And Augustine, now again, he does say, if it hadn't been for the need for reproduction, Adam would have been better off with a dude as company in the garden, which doesn't go over too well in many modern discussions. I can't defend it. It is what it is. But when he looks to talk about the resurrection, he rejects this idea, right? He says, no, women will be women, and they will be beautiful, and they will be more beautiful, but there will be no sexual desire as a result of it, but women will be a glorious part of God's resurrected, transformed reality in eternity, right? And so, again, he's interesting because he has a lot of these tendencies, but he is also immersed in Scripture, and he knows the truth of Genesis, right? That God makes them male and female from the beginning, and it is good, and it is very good. And I think he reflects that, even if he has some challenges. Just the last thing I mentioned, that also in there I give you a couple selections about how he interprets Scripture, which I think is fascinating. Maybe we can come back to, I'll figure out a way to work it in one of the other sessions, but Augustine, when he looks at Genesis, he does not interpret it in a strictly literal way, right? And he says you need to interpret Genesis in a way that fits with how our reason understands the world around us. Now, obviously, in his day, science was not our science. But he basically argues you shouldn't insist on a reading of Scripture, especially Genesis, that conflicts with what wise people have learned about the world around us. Which I think is very interesting when you think about the debates in our own time about how to read Genesis, right? And one of the charges that you will sometimes hear is that the Catholic Church has compromised, right, with evolution or the Big Bang or science, and that the Catholic Church has compromised its commitment to Scripture in order to be more attractive to society. And it's really the Protestants who insist on a literal reading of Genesis who are really holding up Christian tradition. Well, I mean, Augustine is writing in the year 400, and Augustine's view is not the literal fundamentalist reading of Genesis. What Augustine says is you should read Genesis in a way that is compatible with what our reason tells us about the physical world, right? And that the point of Genesis is not to give us the details of how, it's to talk about why God made the world and our relationship to God, not the mechanics of how the human body came together or something like that. So again, I just included that. I meant to talk about it. Aquinas touches on it too, so maybe we can hit it when we talk about Aquinas in a couple of months. So I think, I don't want to be mean to our next presenter, so I should probably wrap it up. But since they're not here yet, any last questions?
In view of his, in light of his view of women, what was his take on the Blessed Virgin? I mean, obviously, she was a required part of the whole picture.
No, he
What did you think of St. Monica?
Yeah.
I think, well, depends when you asked him. No, I mean, he says, I mean, he has all of what you would usually expect in terms of appreciation for Mary and her role. Now, the exact details of like Mary's sinlessness and all that had not really been worked out in Augustine's day. So when Augustine is arguing with Pelagius about how everybody is a sinner, he'll say, well, everybody is a sinner. About Mary, I'm not going to say anything because the church is still kind of sorting that out. So in Augustine's day, it hadn't been kind of formally defined like it is for us. But he does recognize her as being a special case. So I think he would have no problem with the way the understanding developed. That's a good question.
So he's instrumental in the development of the philosophy of the church.
Yeah, I mean,
What is
he
St. Paul
I'm sorry?
What is St. Paul to the development of the church? What is St. Paul? Augustine is here, St. Paul is here. Are they parallel?
Well, I mean, it's hard to compare.
Yeah.
Augustine is very largely shaped by Paul. So especially his ideas about how salvation works. It comes out of his these experiences, but it also comes out of, he reads St. Paul a lot. Tries to figure out some of those hard passages, and that shapes a lot of that too. So I wouldn't put him above St. Paul. Sort of between Paul and our own day, I think you'd have trouble finding anyone more important than Augustine, with Aquinas being the little. But what Aquinas does, and we'll talk about this, Aquinas more collects the tradition up to his day and puts it into a coherent system, which is really his major accomplishment. Augustine is doing a lot more kind of original, coming up with new ways of thinking about some of these issues. I mean, they're both huge figures.
Well, was Aquinas aware of Lilith, the old historical in the Bible?
Oh, Augustine?
Augustine, yes, I'm sorry, Augustine.
I can't say.
Because according to old history, she was the first wife of Adam. But I
Yeah.
guess in mythology, so
I mean,
maybe
that's
in
like-
the Greek tradition, she's very bold and,
Yeah, I don't recall encountering that, and
Okay.
the fathers, they don't talk about.
that's right.
It's more of an extra biblical
Mm-hmm.
thing, and they don't really deal
An
with it.
interesting character, according to history,
Yeah, I think it comes out of Jewish, kind
tradition
of
more.
apocryphal, mystical tradition.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, so part of our work is we do marriage preparation and marriage convalidation. So if we took this class to help us with that, so what could we take from this in a very quick paragraph that would help us help our couples?
Yeah. That's a good question. I might need to really answer that. I might need to ruminate a little more. I would say, I would acknowledge that there have been some challenges in the churches dealing with sex and marriage over the years. A lot of those things can be traced back to Augustine's own struggles, probably the struggles of many other people, and to the philosophy that shaped a lot of. But I do think it's important that in the tradition, in the official tradition, there's some struggles, but there's always still an underlying affirmation of its goodness, right? And that,
Yeah, I like the fact that they can identify with some of them in today's generation.
Yeah.
A lot of them are coming from a bad place, and when you give them somebody that they can identify with, and the fact that he was able to overcome a lot of that and get the grace of God, then I think that's what I took back from
yeah,
today.
yeah. And I mean, and the things that the way he overcomes it, I think, is still, right? That it's God's grace, but he also gets support from his family. He's reading scripture, and he learns. I think he gets help from outside, from his philosophical studies and all of that. So,
Well, when our couples who have been living together for a long period of time hear theology of the body, which is like they're here, it should have been done here, it's easy for them to see, well, if you do A, B, C, and D, then you too will be able to start living, a sacramental marriage the way it's meant to be.
yeah.
Thank you.
All of the problems basically lie at the foot of women, don't you think?
Where's my husband? He would agree.
Don't you think?
I'm pretty sure that camera is still on. So,
I think
We'll put that question
I
to
think we
Jesse.
can all